It began with death that looked ordinary. A quiet suburban home in Springfield, Missouri, filled with the sound of church hymns, the faint smell of cleaning supplies, and the hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen. To anyone passing by, it looked like a typical, peaceful household in a small American town, but behind those walls, a woman was slowly turning her family into corpses one by one. In 2012, 61-year-old Mark Stout, a local musician beloved by friends, collapsed suddenly and died. Doctors called it natural causes. A tragedy, yes, but nothing suspicious. Months later, 26-year-old Shaun, the autistic son of Mark and Diane, also died, this time in agony, coughing and convulsing before slipping away. Again, it was ruled as natural, and then came Sarah, Diane's daughter, who began to fall violently ill. But this time, Sarah lived long enough to speak, long enough for the truth to surface, and when it did, the horror that emerged was almost unbearable. A mother, calmly stirring antifreeze into her family's drinks, eliminating them one by one, because she saw them as nothing more than burdens. This is the chilling story of Diane Staudte, the organist, the mother, the killer. Springfield, Missouri. 2012. A town where neighborhoods felt safe, where neighbors waved at each other and church bells echoed on Sundays. It was a place where evil wasn't expected, especially not from someone like Diane Staudte. At 51, Diane was a middle-aged suburban mother, known in the community as the church organist. She was the kind of person you saw on Sunday mornings, quiet, polite, ordinary. To those who saw her, she was the ideal mother, the perfect neighbor. But behind her round glasses and conservative smile lay something far colder. Diane wasn't warm. She wasn't maternal. Those who knew her noticed her sharpness, the way she spoke of her husband as a lazy bum, the way she rolled her eyes at her autistic son, Shaun. Her words carried disdain. Her tone, bitterness. To Diane, her family wasn't love. They were problems to be solved. Mark, her husband, was 61, a local musician known for his easy laugh and devotion to his kids. He loved to play guitar, to perform, but to Diane, he was dead weight, a waste of space. Shaun, their son, was 26, living with autism and a brain injury. He struggled socially but adored video games, music, and his family. To Diane, though, he was a pest, an inconvenience. And then there was Sarah, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. But because she still lived at home and relied financially on her parents, Diane saw her as yet another burden. In her mind, they were problems draining her. And Diane wanted solutions. She found one, on a store shelf. Antifreeze, sweet-tasting, deadly, invisible. It started with Mark. In June of 2012, Mark suddenly fell violently ill. Sweating, vomiting, writhing in pain. Doctors struggled to find the cause. Within days, he was gone. His death certificate listed natural causes. His friends were stunned. His children were devastated. Diane? She was calm, even distant. She showed no tears at the funeral. To outsiders, it seemed like quiet grief. But inside, Diane had already moved on. Shaun was next. In September, Shaun began to deteriorate. The strong, vibrant young man became weak, disoriented. He complained of stomach pain, blurred vision, and confusion. Then came the seizures. Diane watched as he collapsed, twitching and foaming at the mouth. She didn't call for help right away. When she finally did, it was too late. Shaun died soon after. This time, doctors noted seizure disorder. Another tragic coincidence, but it wasn't coincidence. It was Diane methodically slipping antifreeze into his drinks, watching as the poison shredded his insides, watching her own son die without remorse, and still, it wasn't enough. Her daughter, Sarah, became the next target. By early 2013, Sarah had fallen severely ill. Nausea, vomiting, her body shutting down piece by piece. But unlike Mark and Shaun, Sarah survived long enough to be taken to the hospital. She was rushed into intensive care. Doctors worked frantically to save her, and as they ran test after test, something odd caught their attention. Kidney failure. Severe, unusual. Sarah told nurses something chilling. "My mom doesn't seem worried. She doesn't visit much." Suspicion began to grow. It started as whispers among the medical staff. Sarah's symptoms, severe kidney failure, metabolic acidosis, were consistent with ethylene glycol poisoning, the primary ingredient in antifreeze. Doctors alerted authorities. The investigation opened quietly. Police questioned Diane. She was calm, polite, even helpful. She explained her husband's death as a stroke, her son's death as seizures. She smiled faintly. She seemed almost relieved they were gone. But investigators dug deeper. An autopsy was ordered. Toxicology tests confirmed it. Both Mark and Shaun had been poisoned with ethylene glycol. Antifreeze detectives confronted Diane. Her response was chilling. She admitted it, not with tears, not with guilt, but with cold simplicity. They were burdens. Mark was lazy. Shaun was a pest. I didn't want Sarah to live like me. No remorse. No hesitation. Just a woman explaining why she eliminated her family. The town was shaken to its core. A church organist, a mother, a killer. The trial began in 2015. Diane entered the courtroom looking like the same middle-aged suburban woman she always was. Glasses, plain clothes, quiet demeanor. But her words were monstrous. Prosecutors painted her as a narcissist who saw her family as disposable. A woman who chose murder over divorce, over patience, over love. They read her chilling confession aloud. I hated Mark. He was lazy. Shaun was a pest. I wanted to be free. The jury stared in disbelief. The gallery, filled with friends and neighbors, gasped, and then came the victim impact statements. Sarah, who survived, stood in front of the court, frail, emotional, her voice trembling. She spoke about her father, her brother, the agony of losing them both. She spoke of the betrayal, the unthinkable truth that her own mother had tried to kill her. She was supposed to protect us. Instead, she destroyed us. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Diane sat expressionless. The jury deliberated. It didn't take long. Diane Staudte was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her daughter, Sarah, watched as her mother, the woman who gave her life, was led away in shackles. Justice had been served. But it was a hollow victory, because nothing could bring back Mark. Nothing could bring back Shaun. And Sarah, the survivor, was left with a lifetime of scars. The community of Springfield, too, was forever haunted. How could someone so ordinary commit something so monstrous? A church organist, a mother, a murderer. But Diane Staudte's cold calculation wasn't the only case where a mother turned into the executioner of her own family. If Diane's motive was bitterness and resentment, our next case is something far darker, where delusion and madness collided with faith. In Texas, a mother stood over a bathtub and believed she was saving her children from the devil himself by drowning them with her own hands. The story of Andrea Yates is one of the most haunting crimes in American history. It began with a mother's love, twisted and warped by the cruel grip of mental illness. In Clear Lake, Texas, on the morning of June 20, 2001, Andrea Yates, a woman once full of life and potential, would commit an unspeakable act of horror. 5 children, Noah, 7, John, 5, Paul, 3, Luke, 2, and Mary, just 6 months old, were methodically drowned in the family's bathtub. A mother, lost to the overwhelming darkness of postpartum psychosis, believed the murders were a righteous act. She truly believed that in killing her children, she was saving them, protecting them from the clutches of Satan. She believed that in her hands lay the power to save their souls, but the chilling reality is that she wasn't saving them, she was destroying them. This is the story of Andrea Yates, once a nurse, a mother, and a wife, whose mind became consumed by delusions, ultimately leading her to commit one of the most horrific acts a mother can commit. Andrea Yates had always been a bright, capable woman, full of promise. Born on July 2, 1964 in Houston, Texas, Andrea was raised in a devout Christian household. Her parents were strict, and their religious beliefs were deeply ingrained in their daily lives. She was a model student in her youth, excelling academically, and eventually went on to become a registered nurse. But Andrea's life took a different turn when she met Rusty Yates, a man who shared her strong religious convictions. They married in 1993 and quickly had children. At the time of the crime, they had 5 children, all of whom were homeschooled. From the outside, they appeared to be the perfect family, living the life of a typical Christian household in suburban Texas. However, as time passed, cracks began to form in Andrea's mental health. She suffered from severe postpartum depression after the birth of her first child, Noah. The depression grew worse with each pregnancy, culminating in a devastating breakdown after the birth of Mary, her youngest child. The mental health challenges Andrea faced were often dismissed by those around her. Despite a history of depression and previous suicide attempts, Andrea was seen by many as a devoted wife and mother. But beneath this facade, she was struggling. Her inner demons were growing louder, and her grip on reality was slipping. By 2001, Andrea had given birth to 5 children, all of whom she cared for with a sense of duty and love. But for Andrea, motherhood was never an easy journey. Each pregnancy had been followed by worsening bouts of postpartum depression, and by the time Mary, her youngest, was born, Andrea was in a severe state of mental distress. She had been struggling with psychosis, which caused her to lose touch with reality. The delusions began to take root in her mind, fueled by a belief that her children were somehow doomed to eternal damnation. Andrea was convinced that the only way to save them from Satan's grip was to kill them. This was not an act of rage or anger, but a misguided, psychotic act of mercy. Andrea truly believed she was doing the right thing. Andrea's belief system was heavily influenced by her extreme religious convictions. She and her husband, Rusty, had been raised in an evangelical Christian environment where sin, the devil, and salvation played a large role in their lives. It was in this environment that Andrea developed her delusional belief system, which led to the horrific crime. As Andrea's mental health deteriorated, she was unable to see the world around her as it truly was. She began to isolate herself from family and friends, retreating further into her delusions. Rusty, although concerned, did not fully recognize the extent of her illness. Despite Andrea's previous suicide attempts and bouts of severe depression, she continued to care for the children as best as she could. However, the pressure of caring for 5 young children combined with her mental illness became an unbearable burden. On June 20, 2001, Andrea Yates's delusions reached their tragic peak. It was a Wednesday morning and Rusty had left for work. Andrea, alone in the house with her 5 children, was overwhelmed by the belief that Satan had already claimed their souls. She saw herself as the only one capable of saving them from eternal damnation. In the calm of that morning, Andrea did something that no one could have imagined. She carefully placed her children in the bathtub one by one and drowned them. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, each child was drowned in the water, their tiny bodies pulled under as Andrea, in a trance-like state, believed she was saving them. Once the unthinkable was done, Andrea laid the bodies of her children on the bed. Their small, lifeless forms were surrounded by the toys, books, and blankets they had once played with. Andrea then calmly called 911. "I killed my children," she told the operator, her voice disturbingly calm. When police arrived at the Yates home, they found the 5 children dead and Andrea sitting silently in a chair. There was no sign of struggle. The scene was eerie in its calmness. Andrea was taken into custody and initially did not speak much. She was placed under psychiatric evaluation, where it became clear that she was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. Her mental state at the time of the crime was immediately questioned, and it soon became evident that she believed her actions were justified. As the investigation unfolded, authorities began to piece together Andrea's troubled history. She had been diagnosed with depression, but it was clear that she had also been experiencing psychosis, an illness that made her believe her delusions were real. Andrea had tried to get help in the past, but the severity of her condition was often overlooked. Her beliefs were tied to her extreme religious views, and her ability to discern reality from her delusions had deteriorated completely. Postpartum psychosis, a rare but extremely dangerous mental illness, is typically characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and severe mood swings that occur after childbirth. For Andrea Yates, this condition manifested in the form of delusions in which she believed her children were doomed to eternal torment. In her psychosis, Andrea became convinced that killing her children was the only way to save them. Andrea's delusions were directly tied to her religious beliefs, which were extreme in nature. She believed that the act of drowning her children would free them from Satan's grasp and save their souls. In her disturbed mind, this was not a crime, but an act of divine intervention. Postpartum psychosis is a medical emergency, and it is important to understand the way it alters a person's perception of reality. Andrea, in her fragile state, was unable to comprehend the severity of her actions. She believed she was fulfilling a divine mandate, saving her children from eternal suffering. To her, there was no guilt. There was no remorse. Only the certainty that she had done what was right. Andrea's trial began in 2002, a year after the tragedy. Her defense team argued that she was not guilty by reason of insanity, as she was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis at the time of the killings. The prosecution, however, argued that Andrea was fully aware of her actions and should be held responsible for the deaths of her children. The courtroom drama was emotional, as experts testified about Andrea's mental health history. Andrea's family and friends painted a picture of a woman who was deeply loving and devoted to her children, but ultimately overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood and her own mental illness. The jury deliberated, and in the end, Andrea was found guilty of 2 counts of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. The case sparked national debates about mental illness, postpartum psychosis, and the responsibilities of healthcare providers in recognizing and treating such conditions. Andrea Yates's story is a tragic reminder of the dangers of untreated mental illness and the devastating effects of postpartum psychosis. Her case has become a symbol for the importance of better mental health care for new mothers and the need for better awareness of postpartum depression and psychosis. In prison, Andrea has received treatment for her condition, and her mental health has improved. She has expressed deep remorse for her actions, though she still believes she was acting out of a misguided sense of duty to protect her children. Andrea remains incarcerated, and the memory of the 5 children she killed continues to haunt her and those who knew her. The tragedy of Andrea Yates forces us to confront a terrifying truth, that a mother's love can be annihilated by the cruel grip of mental illness. She committed her horrific acts believing in her broken reality that she was a savior. But this leads us to a question that is, in its own way, even more chilling. What happens when a mother tries to kill her children not to save them, but simply because they were in her way? The answer lies in the story of Diane Downs, a mother who was not insane but cold, calculated, and utterly heartless. Her story is next. It started with the cries of children, the echo of innocence destroyed by the selfish cravings of a mother consumed by her own urges. On May 19, 1983, in Springfield, Oregon, Diane Downs drove along a lonely road with her 3 youngsters in the backseat of her vehicle. What appeared to be an ordinary day for the Downs household would soon become a nightmare that would linger in the community for decades. By the time Diane finished, her 7-year-old daughter Cheryl was lifeless, and her other 2 children, Christy 8 and Danny 3, would be permanently scarred by the brutal act. Diane Downs, a 27-year-old parent, sat before the police with an unsettlingly steady manner as she described the appalling incident. She insisted a bushy-haired man had shot her kids during an attempted hijacking, but her version was full of contradictions, and as the inquiry deepened, the truth became undeniable. Diane had shot her children not from some tragic accident, but because they were barriers in the way of her affair with a man named Robert Knickerbocker. This is the account of Diane Downs, a woman who, driven by selfish fixation and a complete lack of compassion, would do the unimaginable to satisfy her own cravings. Diane Downs was not someone who would instantly cause suspicion. Outwardly, she looked like the ideal suburban parent, blonde, slender, and pleasant. But those who grew close to Diane quickly realized that beneath her mask of kindness and cheerfulness hid a far darker spirit. Born on August 7, 1955 in Phoenix, Arizona, Diane was the second of 5 siblings. Her early years were unsettled. Her father was distant, and her mother, though caring, struggled with the burden of raising 5 children. Diane learned quickly that to earn recognition, she had to remain the focal point. She formed a craving for admiration, frequently using her charm to influence others into giving her what she wanted. As an adult, Diane wed Steve Downs in 1973, and the pair had 3 children, Cheryl, Christy, and Danny. The union, however, was shaky from the beginning. Diane was known for unstable romances. and not long after Danny's birth, she entered an affair with a man called Robert Knickerbocker. Knickerbocker, already married, became the obsession that would ultimately spark Diane's crime. Her attachment to him was turbulent and filled with yearning. Diane's fixation grew so intense that she started to see her kids not as her duty, but as hurdles to gaining his devotion. By 1983, Diane had already shown patterns of dishonesty and trickery. She even went so far as to forge an adoption letter to get her lover's attention, hoping he would leave his wife for her. Instead of affection, she only met rejection. Knickerbocker, though intrigued by her, made it plain he would not commit to her or her children. This refusal drove Diane to a place where her desire for him eclipsed everything, even her role as a mother. May 19, 1983, started as a routine day. Diane, with her 3 children in the vehicle, was driving through Springfield. She had just collected them from school, and it was a bright day, typical for the region. But that would soon change dramatically. At roughly 10 p.m. that evening, Diane steered her children to a deserted stretch on Old Mohawk Road. There she halted, parked the car, and shot all 3. Cheryl, the eldest, was hit twice in the chest. Christy was struck in the arm and chest, while Danny was shot in the chest and abdomen. Diane then turned the weapon on herself, inflicting a shallow wound to her arm, apparently to stage a scenario of self-defense. She claimed that a bushy-haired man had come to her car, shot her children, and vanished into the woods. Police rushed to the scene swiftly, and Diane was taken to the hospital. Her children, however, were in dire condition. Cheryl was taken into surgery but died of her wounds that night. Christy and Danny survived, though both carried lifelong physical and emotional damage. Christy underwent several operations to repair her injuries, while Danny was left paralyzed permanently due to the gunshots. Despite the magnitude of the crime, Diane's attitude stayed disturbingly calm. She seemed to show minimal sorrow over the death of her daughter and the endless suffering of her surviving children. This absence of grief and the contradictions in her claims instantly raised suspicions among investigators. As detectives pressed further into Diane's version, they quickly detected contradictions. The tale of her run-in with the bushy-haired man failed to align with evidence on site. Authorities found no trace of forced entry into the car or signs of resistance. Moreover, the supposed assailant had not taken anything, which was odd for such a violent attack. Her behavior also raised doubts. Though she described herself as a victim of trauma, Diane displayed no genuine panic or sorrow. She didn't weep for her dead daughter, nor did she show guilt for her injured children. Instead, she emphasized her own minor wound, which looked unusually neat and inconsistent with a real assault. It became evident to police that Diane was not a casualty, but the culprit of a vicious act. More inquiry revealed Diane was romantically involved with Robert Knickerbocker, a married man unwilling to be with her. She had become infatuated with him, and even told people she would do anything to secure his love, including removing her children. It wasn't until Diane's own brother came forward, sharing details of her affair, that the complete motive became clear. Diane was driven to eliminate her children not through madness, but because they blocked her fantasy of being with Knickerbocker. Cheryl, Christy, and Danny had become hindrances to her imagined life. Diane's children, once her pride, were now mere barriers on her path to what she called happiness. Diane Downs embodied many traits of a sociopath: deceptive, devoid of empathy, and controlled by a craving for dominance and attention. Outwardly described as charming, friendly, and lively, her deeds exposed a darker, crueler core. She also displayed histrionic behavior, often exaggerating emotions to draw notice. Her fixation with Robert Knickerbocker dominated her existence. She valued his approval above the well-being of her children, regarding them as obstacles to her satisfaction. This degree of selfishness, combined with her absence of guilt, painted a portrait of a woman ready to sacrifice anyone to gratify her desires. Her lack of sincere sorrow after the crime clearly signaled her disconnection from reality and incapacity to care for her victims. Diane was not a mourning mother. She was a woman consumed by her appetite for attention, prepared to destroy everything to satisfy her obsession. Her trial opened in 1984. Throughout the case, she persisted in portraying herself as the casualty of a random attack. However, as the proof stacked against her, the real picture of her crime emerged. The jury heard testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, and even Diane's family, all outlining a chilling view of her mindset and motives. The prosecution contended that Diane had fabricated the entire crime to conceal her wish to be with Robert Knickerbocker. Her willingness to murder her children, who had once been central to her life, to chase selfish desires, horrified the jury and the public. Diane's lawyers, in contrast, attempted to argue she suffered from a psychological collapse. They claimed her behavior stemmed from postpartum depression and the strain of being a single mother. Yet the jury was unmoved, convicting Diane of 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Diane Downs received a life sentence where she would remain behind bars. In custody, she kept showing the same manipulative tendencies seen at her trial. She sought attention from inmates and tried to charm officers, while still declaring she was falsely judged. Her 2 surviving children, Christy and Danny, were left with scars for life. Christy later became an outspoken supporter of violence victims, sharing her story and survival. Danny, paralyzed from the waist down, endured both the physical and emotional weight of his mother's betrayal. Diane Downs viewed her children as nothing but hindrances to be erased. Her drive was chillingly plain, a selfish hunger for a new life with a man. She was methodical, pitiless, and saw murder as the fix. Her tale forces us to wonder if a mother can truly be evil. But just over 10 years later, another mother, Susan Smith, would also strap her children into their car seats and sink them in a watery grave. She too would blame a made-up hijacker, and she too would insist it was about a man. Yet the question lingers. Was it the same cold calculation as Diane Downs? Or was it another shade of darkness entirely? The case of Susan Smith and the haunting picture of her 2 little boys comes next. It started with a mother's frantic craving for liberation, but the tale concluded in a sea of deception and 2 blameless lives stolen. On October 25, 1994, in Union, South Carolina, Susan Smith, a 23-year-old parent, drove her vehicle into the shadowy waters of John D. Long Lake, ending the lives of her 2 small sons, Michael 3 and Alex 14 months. She left them buckled into their car seats as the car sank, a chilling picture of powerlessness in the face of a mother's icy neglect. What made the calamity even more dreadful was the net of falsehoods that Susan Smith weaved in an effort to disguise her deed. She asserted that an African-American man had hijacked her automobile and plunged it into the lake. This invention captured the nation's focus for days as an intensive hunt for the supposed hijacker commenced, even while Smith's true purpose for murder stayed hidden in plain sight. Susan Smith's crime was not one fueled by necessity or uncontrollable forces. It was an action of selfishness, deceit, and egotism, an attempt to remove her children as barriers in her pursuit of a new existence with her lover, Tom Finley. It was a crime birthed from emotional fragility and a need for personal satisfaction, regardless of the price. This is the account of Susan Smith, a woman who betrayed the very spirit of motherhood, and in doing so, wrecked the lives of everyone around her. Susan LeClaire Smith was born on September 26, 1971, in the tiny town of Union, South Carolina. On the surface, her early life looked ordinary. She was a quiet young girl with a plain, suburban appearance, and for many years she seemed like someone fated for a simple existence. Yet under the mask of normality there were fractures, flashes of mental instability that would later shape her into a woman capable of dreadful behavior. Susan's youth was not free of hardships. Raised by a caring but flawed family, Susan endured significant emotional trauma early in life. Her parents had separated when she was young, and this left her with a feeling of abandonment and deep unease. She battled with feelings of insignificance, constantly yearning for approval from others to fill the emotional emptiness left by her fractured home. By the time she was in her early 20s, Susan found herself trapped in a series of harmful relationships with little self-worth. In 1991, she had 2 sons, Michael and Alex, with her then-spouse, David Smith. The marriage, however, was strained, and eventually, Susan and David went their separate ways. By most accounts, Susan's relationship with her ex-husband was stormy, but she ended up as a single mother, now accountable for 2 small children. In 1994, Susan encountered Tom Finley, a local plant worker who would become her fixation. Tom was a man who, according to Susan's own words, seemed to provide her the affection and care she desperately longed for. Yet he was also married, and their affair was complicated. Tom, while at first keen about their involvement, made it plain that he had no intention of raising her children, nor did he want a future with Susan unless she freed herself from the duties of parenthood. Susan became obsessed with Tom, and he became her escape, a way to finally feel the affirmation and emotional satisfaction that she had sought for so long. But there was an obstacle: her sons. Michael and Alex stood in the path of her future with Tom. She felt caged, weighed down by the obligations of motherhood, and unable to move forward with the existence she imagined. On the fateful evening of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith's desperation to be with Tom reached its breaking stage. She had been battling with the burdens of being a single mother, torn between the demands of her boys and her compulsive need for Tom's attention and acceptance. That evening, Susan decided that her children were the hindrance preventing her happiness. They were no longer the innocent toddlers she once cherished. They had become weights to her personal goals. Michael and Alex needed to be erased. Susan drove her automobile, a 1990 Mazda Protégé, with both children secured in their seats, to John D. Long Lake, a secluded area close to Union. As she neared the water, she purposely guided her car into the lake, watching as the vehicle slowly descended. Her sons, helpless, defenseless, were restrained in their seats as the water climbed around them. The pull of the water soon dragged the car under, and Susan observed as her sons' lives slipped away. They struggled for breath, but Susan offered no aid. She abandoned them to perish, consumed by her own egotistical desires as they gasped for air in the frigid water. After the automobile sank, Susan managed to escape the vehicle and swim to the bank. Soaked and shaken, she instantly invented a tale. She contacted 911, claiming that a black man had hijacked her car and driven it into the lake. She portrayed the supposed attacker as a bushy-haired stranger who had violently pushed her out of the vehicle and fled with her children inside. Susan's claim at first glance seemed believable. The neighborhood rallied around her, giving support, and police began an urgent chase for the supposed hijacker. The media storm quickly followed. For several days, the hunt for the mysterious man ruled the headlines. Yet flaws in Susan's tale began to show almost at once. As the inquiry went on, contradictions in Susan's accounts raised doubts. The details of the alleged hijacking didn't match the actual proof at the site. There were no marks of forced entry or conflict, and there was no evidence that a hijacking had ever taken place. Additionally, Susan's calm behavior, both during and after the ordeal, struck officers as strange. A mourning mother usually reveals signs of despair, but Susan showed minimal visible grief about the loss of her children. The case soon shifted dramatically when Susan's past came under examination. Detectives uncovered her affair with Tom Finley and her wish to be rid of her sons in order to start anew with him. They also discovered her record of deceitful behavior and narcissistic traits, which indicated a woman willing to go to any extremes to obtain what she craved. It wasn't long before Susan's own behavior began to reveal her. The more investigators pressed her, the more her tale unraveled. Finally, Susan collapsed and admitted to what she had done. She confessed that she had ended her sons' lives not in a moment of insanity, but as a deliberate and icy act of egotism. To her, they were hurdles blocking her path to Tom, and she was ready to destroy them to have him. Susan Smith's deeds were not those of a mother overtaken by sorrow or mental sickness. They were the deeds of a woman with severe narcissistic traits, emotionally unstable and deceitful. Throughout her life, Susan had hungered for notice and recognition from others, and she was eager to exploit anyone and everyone to obtain it. She showed classic marks of narcissism, a deep feeling of entitlement, a void of compassion, and a massive need for admiration. Her affair with Tom Finley grew into an obsession, and her children, whom she had once valued, were treated as barriers halting her from reaching the life she wanted. Her sons' needs were meaningless to her. They were merely in her way. Susan's absence of guilt and her composed behavior after the killing suggest that she viewed her deeds as warranted. In her mind, her children's deaths were a vital offering to secure Tom's affection. She was emotionally detached from the seriousness of what she had done, and her deception of those around her, especially police, the press, and the public, shows a chilling absence of compassion and moral duty. Susan Smith's trial began in 1995, just under a year following the killings. The prosecution declared that Susan had slain her children to release herself from the obligations of motherhood and to be with Tom Finley. They drew a portrait of a woman ruled by egotism and selfishness, willing to go to wild lengths to satisfy her own cravings. The defense, however, tried to depict Susan as a grieving parent who had undergone a brief collapse due to emotional instability. They suggested that Susan's despair and emotional struggle had driven her to commit the unthinkable. Ultimately, the jury agreed with the prosecution, convicting Susan of 2 counts of murder. She was handed a life term in prison without the chance of parole. In prison, Susan Smith would have years to reflect on her crime, though it remains uncertain if she has ever genuinely felt remorse. She has sought to appeal her punishment and has occasionally expressed sorrow for her deeds. But her conduct on the night of the killings reflects a degree of cold planning that makes it hard to believe she truly grasps the depth of her offense. Michael and Alex were dearly loved by their relatives. Their lives were brutally ended because of their mother's greed, and the wounds of their deaths have haunted their extended family and the town ever since. For Susan, the memory of her deed is one of emptiness, not only of her sons but also of her own humanity. Her tale is a grim warning of how a mother's devotion can be overshadowed by egotism and selfishness, and how the results of such actions are devastating for everyone involved.